welcome to the National Association of Scholars' continuing series of webinars on American history. We have gone from 1620 chronologically onward, and we are getting up to 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War. The panel is on, how did the war start? What role did secession and states' rights play in the move to war? What role did slavery play in the outbreak of the war? How did the war shape our national understanding of what it means to be the United States? In a mere 90 minutes. So we are delighted to have three very distinguished panelists whose distinguished career is going to be mentioned in various of their books in the chat button below. I'm not going to say it all because it would take the 90 minutes. But Dr. Richard Carwardine is Rhodes Professor of American History Emeritus at the University of Oxford. He also served as president of Corpus Christi College and is the author of numerous works on Abraham Lincoln, including Lincoln, A Life of Purpose and Power. Dr. Joan Waugh is Professor of History Emeritus at the UCLA Department of History, author of numerous books and essays on the Civil War, including prize-winning U.S. Grant, American Hero, American Myth. Dr. Brian Jordan is Associate Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Sam Houston State University, author of, among other things, Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War. Now, before I let them start speaking, and the order, by the way, for speaking will be Joan, Brian, and Richard. Just to tell everybody, each of the panelists speaks for perhaps 10, 12 minutes or so, informally. There is then, following each of them, questions and answers from the audience. That's you. Please provide them in either, the chat or the question and Q&A buttons at the bottom of your screen. I will then pass them on, although the professors also can answer directly. My only order is, what do I think will be a fun question next for the conversation? I should reassure you, if your question doesn't get answered, send email to me afterwards, randall@nas.org. I will then forward your question to the panelists so that they may choose to answer your question. So in effect, don't worry about not getting answered here. There's plenty of time. I will also mention this is getting recorded for posterity, so you will be able to see this later. Everybody who is watching should be getting a link afterwards to where this is recorded. National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Having said all that, I would like to welcome, I believe that was Joan first?
Yes.
Oh, so please.
I am delighted to be a part of this conversation with two such eminent colleagues to speak about our assigned topic on the causes of the Civil War. And by the way, David, it's 12 to 14 minutes we were given as the time. So I will use every bit of that.
Certainly.
The angle for my short presentation is contained within the question, was the Civil War an irrepressible conflict? To answer, I emphasize the idea of two opposing civilizations trapped within a single republic, accompanied by a few helpful visual aids. I will begin with a quote from Republican William Seward and then proceed to argue that the same forces that unified the country, technological advancements, a growing population, and geographical expansion also brought about deep divisions. New York Senator William Henry Seward's irrepressible conflict speech delivered in Rochester, New York, on October 25th, 1858, highlighted tensions between slave and free states, declaring, quote, "These antagonistic systems are continually coming into closer contact and collision results. It is an irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces, and it means that the United States must and will, sooner or later, become entirely a slave-holding nation or entirely a free labor nation." His words support the idea of two divergent societies struggling within one constitutional framework. If I could have the map of the United States in 1853 up, that would be great. That's the next one. So let's examine the three forces that both united the country and divided the country. The first is a revolution in communications and transportation that dramatically shrank time and space with the rapid growth and spread of telegraphs, canals, steamboats, and railroads. Connected to the above revolution is the second revolution or force, the growth in population. Between 1830 and 1860, the number of Americans increased by 33% from almost 13 million to 31.5 million. Geographical expansion and settlement provides the third element, dramatically illustrated by the addition of the huge Mexican secession in 1848, which increased the size of the United States by 25%. It sparked an amazing growth in the economy that has been rightly described as the market revolution that turned a largely subsistence economy into a nationally integrated one, in which internal improvements, technological innovations, and rapid urbanization brought prosperities to all regions, including the South. Slave-grown cotton comprised more than half of all American exports from 1815 to 1860. And while it was grown in the South, the capital and essential services for the product was in the hands of northern banks and mill owners. Again, it bears repeating, despite unifying elements, northern and southern states developed in divergent ways that can be traced to the institution of slavery that was present in one part of the country, and it made it possible for a dual system of property rights to exist. So you had this flourishing and integrated economy existing, but it also led to tensions. Why? The communications revolution meant that the word of sectional strife in one part of the nation quickly spread elsewhere. Two examples of many come to mind: the caning of Charles Sumner in 1856 and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859. Both quickly reached a national audience. These events, needless to say, caused ill feeling between North and South. Thus, sectionalism, the idea that each section, North and South, put forward its own interests before the nations, increasingly defined the national political scene by the 1850s. In terms of demographics, the fact that population growth in the free states far exceeded that in the slaveholding states created a deepening sense of peril for many slaveholders. The admission of California, Minnesota, and Oregon swelled the number of US senators from non-slaveholding states with no prospect of new slaveholding states to counter the trend. Florida and Texas, as you can see on the visual, both admitted in 1845, were the last slaveholding states to join the Union. Moreover, most of the nation's new immigrants in the 1850s settled in the North, many in the rapidly growing cities that made the region far more urban than the South. The North also possessed an overwhelming preponderance of the nation's industrial, commercial, and financial state. You could move to the next visual, new states 1836 to 1861. Geographical expansion stood at the center of sectional tensions and spilled over to political debates over the question of slavery's expansion into the federal territories. Beginning in the late 1840s, large numbers of Northerners supported a free soil movement that sought to prevent slavery's introduction into the territories. It is important to note here that most of the residents of the free states thought in terms of the federal territories being reserved for white men and their families. Religious, cultural, and reform movements in the North also contributed to sectionalism. Notable were the splits between the northern and southern wings in the major political denominations, such as the Baptists and Methodists, that further support the depiction of a union heading toward disintegration. Also notable was the rise of militant abolitionism that was led by white and Black men and women. A much more moderate and influential Northern anti-slavery movement seized on the connection between freeing slaves and free labor, so well defined by Abe Lincoln when he said, quote, "Free labor, the just and generous and prosperous system, which opens the way for all, gives hope to all, and energy and progress and improvement of condition to all," expressing, of course, the ideal, not always the reality of capitalism. Major disruptive moments that punctuated the timeline of North-South division are well known, from the Mexican War in 1846 to 48, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the Dred Scott decision of 1857, and John Brown's raid in 1859. All of the above and more are crucial to understanding the breakdown of this actually remarkably stable second party system that had framed national politics and contained the slavery issue based on compromise since at least since 1820, but this party system flourished in the mid 1830s. Well, what happened in the 1850s was that it broke down, beginning with the splitting of the Whig Party into northern and southern wings, leading to its demise. If you could forward to the next slide showing the political successors to the Whig Party. And there was something happening with the oldest Democratic Party in the world, the Democratic Party of the United States. It was becoming a Southern Democratic sectional party that increasingly seemed to voters in the free states serving as a tool of the slaveholding class, and increasingly in the power of so-called fire eaters, such as William Yancey of Alabama and Edmund Ruffin of Virginia, who loudly proclaimed secession. Previous scholars have emphasized, and rightly so, the powerful ties connecting American citizens across sectional lines, including a common language, a shared religious sensibility, and a shared history that celebrated the revolution against Great Britain, most notably celebrated on the 4th of July. But here's one thing: we can see the commonalities, but we also know that many white Northerners and Southerners believed that there were serious and growing divisions, and that is what matters. By 1860, Northerners saw in the South a society fundamentally shaped by the presence of slavery and at odds with the modern world. The popularity of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin brought to light the human costs of enslavement. For their part, white Southerners thought Northerners an antagonistic and meddling people determined to undermine the South's slavery-based social system. Out of the ashes of the Whigs came the Republican Party, a purely sectional organization with no appeal in the South. They first ran a presidential candidate in 1856, pledging to protect slavery where it existed, but with a platform calling for a total ban of slavery into the territories that carried forward in their platform of 1860. By the time of its national convention at Charleston and Baltimore in 1860, the Democratic Party, like the Whigs, also foundered on the issue of slavery in the territories, leaving the country without a single national party. The next visual, please. Only about 1/3 of white Southern families owned slaves, as you can see in this very colorful visual. And most of those held fewer than 5. But all white Southerners had a stake in the system of slavery because as white people, they belonged to the region's controlling class. White Southerners, regardless of economic status, were made equal by the fact of Black slavery. For this reason, white Southerners saw slavery not as an evil force, but rather as a necessary and benevolent institution, They, needless to say, reacted very defensively to criticism. Abraham Lincoln's election triggered 7 of the 15 slave-holding states to secede between December 20th, 1860 and February 1st, 1867. All subsequent attempts at compromise during the secession winter to keep the 8 remaining slave-holding states within the Union failed, and an outbreak of violence soon doomed further efforts to find a peaceable solution when on April 12, 1861, the Confederates commenced a bombardment on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Please, the last visual. The surrender of Union forces was followed by Lincoln's call on April 15th for 70,000 90-day volunteers, marking the beginning of the most transformative event in United States history. I began these remarks with New York Republicans William Seward suggesting that slavery was at the heart of the conflicts tearing the nation apart. He described the division as one leading to a, quote, irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces. Was the Civil War an irrepressible conflict? Could it have been stopped? I don't think so. 2 elements of Southern slave society helped make it, the secession crisis, into an irrepressible conflict: economic self-interest and a race-based social system. Preservation of slavery as an economic system and preservation of white supremacy was a central and interrelated concern. As the newly installed Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens of Georgia, put it in his famous cornerstone speech, quote, slavery was the immediate cause of the late rupture and the present revolution to establish Southern independence. Because of slavery's importance, it makes sense that the election of 1860 triggered the secession crisis and the war that was an irrepressible conflict. Thank you.
And thank you so much. If we may go to our next speaker.
Well, thank you so very much, everyone, for being here. It is an honor to join my 2 distinguished colleagues in this conversation this afternoon. By 1855, abolitionists in the United States had sufficient cause to feel dismayed, disheartened. 5 years before, compromising Congress had served up a draconian new fugitive slave law, conscripting all Americans into the government's slave-catching army. High-profile renditions of freedom-seeking enslaved persons like Anthony Burns seized national headlines, while free Blacks in places like South Central Pennsylvania justifiably feared kidnap. Just 1 year prior, in 1854, Congress had passed and President Franklin Pierce had signed the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, a measure that opened the vast western lands of the Louisiana Purchase, once earmarked for freedom, now to the possibility of slavery. The offending bill touched off a foot race between free soil farmers and pro-slavery Southerners. In 1855, that foot race was quickly devolving into a farce, one marked by manufactured majorities and dueling territorial legislatures, and eventually a guerrilla war whose brutal ferocity would masquerade behind the moniker Bleeding Kansas. Yet even as so many of his fellow abolitionists lost hope, Frederick Douglass kept faith. Ever the keen and prescient observer of American politics, the abolitionist believed that events moved with a certain inexorable logic. More precisely, Douglass appreciated the capacity of events to betray hidden, incontrovertible truths. Douglass insisted that with the Fugitive Slave Act and the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, white Southern slaveholders had, in his words, overreached. With these bold moves, the enslavers had revealed, he thought, their aggressive hand, making obvious the ugly reality that they were party to a dastardly conspiracy to make slavery national and freedom, well, freedom nowhere. Having abandoned the founding consensus that slavery was a necessary evil for the intellectual dishonesty of the pro-slavery ideologue, Southern enslavers would no longer brook compromise or rest content with slavery confined to the states where it already existed. As the fevered dreams of the filibusters and the architects of foreign manifestos made clear, the Southern planter class was already gazing lustily beyond national borders, eyeing a global slaveholding empire. Now the great masses of the people find out by experience, Douglas observed, that the wolf is indeed among them. Indeed, the abolitionists have now a most potent ally in the slave power. Slaveholders are unconsciously performing a good service in the cause of liberty by demonstrating in their conduct the truthfulness of the sentiments advanced and advocated by the abolitionists. As usual, Frederick Douglass was onto something. Over the course of the 1850s, events lent credence to conspiracy theories that, in the void created by the collapse of the second party system, became, I think, increasingly plausible. Events like the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, the signing of the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, and the handing down of the Dred Scott decision gathered a certain and collective momentum. They combined to advance the argument that slavery posed a real and existential threat to white liberty, free speech, and self-government. This was precisely the case that Abraham Lincoln made on June the 16th, 1858, in his famous House Divided speech, in which he figured Stephen, Franklin, Roger, and James, Stephen Douglas, Franklin Pierce, Roger Taney, and James Buchanan, as hapless workmen notching and fitting timbers into a house to protect slavery. Humanitarian arguments against slavery, as old as the Republic itself, had failed in the antebellum years to gain adherents beyond a tiny knot of abolitionists and a slightly larger constellation of anti-slavery reformers. But the force and logic of events in the 1850s persuaded many more mainstream Americans that slavery was indeed a malignant cancer on the Republic, that compromise was no longer desirable or maybe even possible, that the slaveholder would not yield until he had planted his peculiar institution everywhere he had the mind to take it. Over the course of the 1850s, Americans watched as white Southerners made bolder and more insistent demands in defense of slavery. Demands, again, that stood in sharp contrast to their posture in the years of the early Republic. Recall that Southerners made scarcely a protest when slavery was excluded from the Northwest Territory. Recall that many Southerners obliged Henry Clay with the Compromise of 1820. After the Missouri crisis awoke Thomas Jefferson like a fire bell in the night. Recall that the Old Dominion even considered emancipation in 1832 after Nat Turner twisted prophecy into frenzy and hacked 60 white men, women, and children to death in Southside Virginia. But after the forced removal of indigenous peoples underwrote a cotton boom, after slavery became increasingly profitable and cotton production ever more efficient, such a posture was perhaps no longer possible. Slavery became an uninterrogated positive good. In a dynamic society, as Joan has explained, in the throes of technological, infrastructural, and cultural change, the defense of slavery became a sort of perverse rallying cry. Southerners clung to their own facts. They wielded their own vision of the founders and of the future. Both were increasingly incompatible with historical reality, haunted as they were by the telling and perennial fear of a servile insurrection. White Southerners relied on their own dubious set of facts as the pretext for a costly war with Mexico, a naked, aggressive attempt to acquire more land for slavery. Only the Herculean effort of Henry Clay prevented the nation from going to war with itself after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded a third of Mexico's territorial sovereignty to the United States. Included in the ensuing Compromise of 1850 would be a measure intended to put teeth into the largely feckless Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, an odious provision in 1850 that many dubbed the Bloodhound Law, that many rightly perceived as a departure from the nation's founding principles. Alleged fugitives were not permitted to testify on their own behalf, and commissioners who presided over hearings regarding the status of fugitives were paid a bonus if they found in favor of a claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. There was a Boston once, the abolitionist Theodore Parker rued. Now there is a northern suburb to the city of Alexandria, Virginia. Implicated in the kidnap of free blacks, many white Northerners felt that they now had no choice but to yield up their old ambivalence. As though the country was not sufficiently roiled by the Bloodhound Law, 4 years later, Stephen Douglas repealed explicitly the Missouri Compromise, opening the northern reaches of the Louisiana Purchase lands to the possibility of slavery with his Kansas-Nebraska Act and its much-hyped analgesic called popular sovereignty. Such a move, decried even members of his own party, was a gross violation of a sacred pledge, part and parcel of an atrocious plot that would imperil the Republic. The move indeed roused Abraham Lincoln from his self-imposed political slumber. Our Republican robe is soiled, he pleaded at Peoria, Illinois in October of 1854, imploring his fellow Americans to readopt the Declaration of Independence, to repurify themselves in the blood of the American Revolution. Instead of embodying the best principles of democracy, popular sovereignty in practice meant stuffed ballot boxes and manufactured majorities, fraudulently seated pro-slavery territorial legislatures and bogusly imported slave codes, cunning attempts to flout the popular will, mock the marketplace of ideas, suppress free speech, and steal another slave state through the back door with the Lecompton Constitution. Gag rules and bogus laws ransacked newspaper offices and bludgeoned United States senators. These things told a tale more convincing than any abolitionist lecture ever had. No sooner had former Whigs such as Lincoln and disaffected Democrats such as Salmon Chase forged an alliance to resist Kansas-Nebraska than 80-year-old Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared their efforts altogether moot. With the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the Supreme Court declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. The federal government could do nothing that might abridge slaveholders' rights in the Western territories. Well, the handwriting was on the wall. If there was no such thing as a free territory, then it would soon follow that there was no such thing as a free state. Dred Scott's residence at Fort Snelling in the Wisconsin Territory had supplied the logic for his case and the ensuing court decision. Anti-slavery activists now feared a second Dred Scott case emanating from a free state. The aggression of white Southern slaveholders would not stop until their fears of a shrinking South were assuaged. By 1860, white Southerners had perfected their peculiar brand of preemptive warfare on behalf of slavery. Heading into that year's Democratic National Convention held in Charleston, South Carolina, they made burdensome demands on the party's platform. They insisted on the repeal of the personal liberty laws and called for a constitutional amendment that would protect slavery in perpetuity. Jefferson Davis, the senator from Mississippi, proposed reopening the transatlantic slave trade and, seeking perhaps to close the loophole opened by the Freeport Doctrine, called for a federal slave code. When these demands were rejected as unpalatable by the presumptive nominee, Stephen A. Douglas, white Southerners walked out of the convention hall and weeks later nominated their own candidate. The fracture of the Democratic Party nearly assured the election of the Republican Abraham Lincoln as a minority president that fall. Lincoln's election, the immediate and long-term consequence of their own intractable demands, prompted slaveholders one by one to pull their states out of the Union from December of 1860 to May of 1861. a decade of anti-democratic agitation had, unsurprisingly, culminated not just in the armed takeover of military installations, but in the studied refusal to abide by the results of a democratically held presidential election. And so, as Lincoln rhapsodized in his second inaugural, and so the war came. Shells arced over Charleston Harbor and hurtled toward Fort Sumter in the bloodless opening to our nation's bloodiest war. Ensuing events would only continue to expose what Douglas would call in 1855 the mighty truth. As if to mock conservative Democrats in the North and pro-slavery theorists in the South, enslaved persons took advantage of the war's dislocations, voted with their feet, and rushed behind the federal lines, seeking a liminal sort of sanctuary. The mounting human costs and stubborn persistence of the Southern Rebellion reluctantly persuaded too many loyal patriotic citizens that in order to save democracy, the nation would have to end slavery. The cause of union became the cause of emancipation. No one, though, not even Frederick Douglass, knew how or if that uneasy alliance forged in wartime would endure. Thank you.
And thank you so much. If we can now go to our third speaker, Professor Corradine.
Hello from England. It's good evening here. And I must add my voice to the other two contributors to this discussion and say how grateful I am to have been invited and how pleased I am to be sitting alongside, notionally at least, sitting alongside Joan and Brian. They've put flesh on what Abraham Lincoln said in his second inaugural address in 1865. He said all knew that the interest in slaves was somehow the cause of the war. Both have shown how national political parties blew up during the 1850s and how the election of a sectional Republican president in 1860 explains the timing of the crisis. I also share the view that differences over the nation's future were irreconcilable. Now, this leaves me alone to discuss the war itself. So I aim in my 14 minutes to cover 4 years and shall make 4 key points. There are other points I could make, but let me restrict them to 4. First, the states of the Deep South seceded in the winter of 1860-61 explicitly to protect slavery, and in due course pursued a war of unimagined bloodshed to protect an economy and social order founded on human bondage. Confederates used a states' rights interpretation of the Constitution in justification, but that argument was secondary to their primary concern, which was that they should ensure that they lived under a government friendly to slavery. After the war, Southerners generally denied that the future of slavery was what drove them to fight. Rather, they insisted the South had fought to defend the precious constitutional principle of states' rights and self-government against Washington's centralizing tyranny. But let me give you just 2 contemporary pieces of evidence out of many to refute this states' rights reading. The first is South Carolina's Declaration of the Causes of Secession, a document adopted by the Secession Convention at Charleston. This dissolved the state's connection with the Union and set off a chain reaction across the Deep South. The Declaration set out a legal basis for secession before explaining why separation was imperative. And their whole case was about protecting slavery against Northern efforts to injure slave owners' interests by blocking the return of runaway slaves, by encouraging slave rebellions, is a reference to John Brown's Harper's Ferry raid, and most immediately by electing a party that would, in Lincoln's own words, put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. Here was an existential threat. My second example is the speech that Joan referred to herself, Alexander Stephens' Confederate cornerstone speech. Stevens, the Confederate vice president, delivered this in March of 1861. And he said, you just quote here, "The new constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to African slavery. The prevailing ideas entertained by the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old constitution were that the enslavement of the African was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." My second key point is this. Although the South from the first fought to defend its slave interests, the North's broad unity, which was evident in the initial stampede of volunteers, was not to end slavery, but to suppress a rebellion against the constitutional government of a cherished union. At first, only a minority of anti-slaverites demanded a war to exterminate human bondage. What united the vast majority in the loyal states was a conviction that the American Union had a special role in history. It was much more than an economic entity, this union, powerful though that economic question was, given the nation's material potential and the manifest rewards of regionally interconnected economies. The United States possessed a liberty far exceeding, as one put it, far exceeding that of any other of the nations of the earth. To let Confederate traitors smash the Union would be to destroy the nation's unique experiment in representative government and mass democracy, the first of its kind in history, though of course restricted to white males at that point. As Lincoln put it, most governments have been based on the denial of the equal rights of men. But the Declaration of Independence showed that the nation had been born by affirming those rights. Lincoln thought the Union's value lay in its precious cargo, not in the Union itself. It was what the ship carried: liberty, equality, social fluidity, democratic government. Preserving the cargo made war an inevitable duty. Further, the Union carried religious significance. Belonging to one of the most churched Christian nations on earth, many Northerners, Protestant and Catholic, treated the conflict as a holy war. It has to be said in passing that that was exactly how Southern defenders of slavery saw the war too, as a holy war for the protection of the scriptural institution of slavery. But in the North, both conservative and anti-slavery religious nationalists helped to shape politics in the Union through the 4 years of fighting. In due course, those two groups would power the ideological batteries of opposing political parties. But initially, they shared a conviction that America had a special place in God's providence. Every nation had an obligation to follow the righteous path. The American Union, under God, was destined to be an agent of moral and political transfiguration. So at first, Northern religious communities united on a common platform, a great people's war for Christian democracy. There were a few principled pacifists, of course, Quakers and Mennonites, but the vast majority of Northern clergy supported, and their congregations, supported a war against national annihilation. One editor doubted if, in the history of the world, as he put it, so many pulpits had thundered against rebellion, convinced that America had a special place in God's providence. Every nation was a moral being with an obligation to follow the righteous path. The American Union under God was destined to be an agent of moral and political transfiguration. My third point is that the North's conflict became a war of emancipation for the enslaved through a combination of elements: military imperatives, shifting political assessments, the role of the slaves themselves, and presidential initiative. Most Unionists initially accepted that the slavery constitutional protections, the protections of slavery in the Constitution, should continue. In July of 1861, Congress passed a resolution of war aims, so-called Johnson-Crittenden resolutions. The Union wasn't fighting to overthrow slavery, but to maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and preserve the Union. This was meant to reassure Unionists in the loyal slaveholding border states, particularly, of course, Kentucky, as well as the conservative majority in the North. So as president, Lincoln trod cautiously and constitutionally. He overturned the orders of military commanders, John Fremont and David Hunter, that had freed the slaves of rebel masters. He urged loyal slaveholders in the border states to adopt schemes of compensated emancipation, and then he resisted the demands of anti-slavery radicals. But a watershed was reached after the humiliating failure of McClellan's Peninsula Campaign in the summer of 1862. This failure prompted calls for a hard war against the Confederacy and the slave-based economy that supported the South's military capacity. Lincoln fully grasped that the old Union had gone forever, and that the indispensable means, as he put it, the indispensable means of national preservation entailed an edict of emancipation in his capacity, issued in his capacity as commander-in-chief. He saw that the stern facts of a long war meant that slavery would be extinguished by, as he put it to border state representatives, would be extinguished by mere friction and abrasion, by the mere incidents of the war. Slaves themselves were taking matters into their own hands. Tens of thousands of refugees from bondage were crossing the lines into Union military camps where they were kept as contraband of war. At the same time, the voices of Protestant anti-slavery nationalists were growing more forceful. Church petitions, ministerial delegations to the White House, the righteous tone of the political press, and articulate African-American voices, not least Frederick Douglass, all let Lincoln know that the North's broad pre-war religious tolerance of Southern slavery as the price of union was yielding to the belief that national righteousness demanded emancipation. Lincoln's preliminary emancipation proclamation issued after the Battle of Antietam, declared a victory, was followed on New Year's Day, 1863, with a final proclamation freeing the slaves in areas still under Confederate control. That meant that the federal armies became forces of liberation, and they included armed African Americans. Some 200,000 soldiers and sailors were involved in Union military action by the war's end. Their example naturally raised the sharp question of their future status. In Lincoln, they had a president who was increasingly forceful in pressing their claims to citizenship. Lincoln also made it his business to ensure that the Union platform for the 1864 presidential election backed a constitutional amendment that would terminate and forever prohibit the existence of slavery. This gigantic evil, as the platform called it, would prohibit the existence of slavery within the jurisdiction of the United States. And that journey towards what would become the 13th Amendment would begin soon after Lincoln's election victory in November of 1864, although of course final ratification didn't take place until the end of 1865, well after Lincoln's death. My final key point is this. Above all, we may describe, I think, the Union victory and the national reunification that it augured as a second American Revolution. one which aligned the nation more closely with the still unfulfilled principles of the first revolution of 1776, namely the natural and equal rights of humankind as set out in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln said before the war began, "While we do not propose any war upon capital, we do wish to allow the humblest man an equal chance to get rich with everybody else." He pursued the theme in his wartime addresses to Congress. "This is essentially a people's contest," he wrote in July of 1861. "It is a struggle for maintaining that form of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life." 6 months later, in December of 1861, in his first annual address to Congress, he expressed something akin to the labor theory of value. "Labor," he wrote, "is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration." As the premier self-made man of the age, Lincoln provided the perfect embodiment of the recognizably modern processes of economic development and self-improvement. Lincoln's struggle and that of the Union he represented can be seen as an assault on ancestral privilege and the widening of, not an assault on, but an endorsement of the widening of life chances as individuals freed themselves from social hierarchies that prescribed the social position, one's social position, according to birth and not merit. As a self-made man from humble origins, Lincoln stood for the dignity of labor. As a statesman and war leader, he embraced the modernization of a national economy, while the slave-based economy of the war-torn South struggled to meet the demands placed upon it. So, to conclude, the successful fight for the American Union played a major inspirational role in the post-war era of liberal and democratic nationalism. In principle, the United States stood for a modern nation, one premised not upon racial identity or states' rights, but upon a more inclusive idea of a common people joined by democratic and civic principles. The post-war story was, as we know, also one of Black rights denied, of Native Americans dispossessed and slaughtered, of muscular corporations, and of the tightening bonds on wage labor. These features may qualify, but they should not obscure the transformational significance of the American Civil War.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so very much. Now, I am going to go, if at all possible, straight to questions from the audience. And I should say, by the way, at any point, if you want to just respond to one another, just chat and go from that. I'm going to start with a question from the audience, but feel free at any point to have a happy, spontaneous conversation. Ed Shapson asked a question which I'm going to rephrase slightly. What if Lincoln served as our 15th president and Buchanan was number 16? Would Lincoln have been able to avoid secession and the outbreak of civil war? Would Buchanan have been able to restore the Union? I'm going to slightly alter that. What if the Northern vote had consolidated behind John Fremont in 1856, such that you had a Republican president in 1856? All counterfactuals are difficult at best, but do you think that would have been possible to head off the Civil War? Would it have made it come more quickly? So impossible to tell, but let me give you that counterfactual, and what do you say would be most plausible? Whoever wants to volunteer for that one first.
That's a rich question and complicated. John Fremont was, I would predict disaster if he was elected president. I don't believe that he would be elected president or he had any chance, but if he were, I think it possibly would hasten the secession rather than stave it off.
Because, I'm sorry, tell us a little bit more about why.
I believe that his administration and his policies would hasten the sense of urgency of Southern secessionists who during the 1850s, they're the fire eaters, this group of men had a plan. And the plan was to actually destroy the Democratic Party and they got their way in 1860 when, as we know, 4 separate candidates ran and destroyed the Democratic Party because they wanted the Southern states to secede. Not many people agreed with him for most of the time that they were operating from the time of John C. Calhoun in the 1830s to the 1860s, but I think it was there. We're talking about counterfactual history, so I'm just giving my strong opinion there.
Okay. Anybody else want to volunteer for this one?
I think it's important for us to recall what Abraham Lincoln was actually doing during this period as president-elect, which some historians often call his period of masterful inactivity. He's doing nothing to try to rile the South, but he's also making clear that his support for the Fugitive Slave Act, making public his support for a 13th Amendment that would preserve slavery where it existed. And even that was not enough, right? The very fact that the Republican Party was going to stand in the way of slavery expanding into the Western territories was just a bridge too far, even despite all of the assurances. So I think that's important context as we consider that counterfactual.
I think we should also remember that the South in 1856, during the campaign of 1856, were very clear that were there to be a Republican administration, that they would embark on a process of secession. Of course, the Republicans in 1856 said this was just scaremongering, that it could be ignored, that they were in fact the party of the Union, that there were plenty of non-slaveholders in the South who would support the Republicans if only they could run candidates there. I share with Joan the view that had Fremont been elected, who knows what would have happened between November and March. I mean, he was a hothead in all sorts of ways and certainly would not have brought the calm rationality that Lincoln did. Let us assume that, however, that somehow Lincoln had been a candidate in 1856. Of course, he was. I mean, he was up for the vice presidency. Let us assume that he had been elected in 1856, and the South had allowed him to take office. That would still have raised all kinds of profound problems for the Union. But what we can be sure of is that Lincoln would not have done what Buchanan did, which was to tolerate the shenanigans over the Lecompton Constitution. Lincoln would not have been beholden to dough faces as Buchanan was. Buchanan was only in office, after all, because he was propitiating the interests of Southerners. How Lincoln would have dealt with the Tawney decision in 1857 as president is an interesting matter. He would have finessed that, I think, in a way in which he did during his debates with Douglas. He would say this is just one decision, and it's reversible. It doesn't bind the country forever. So, but this, as you say, all counterfactual, and I'm pretty certain that Lincoln would not have been allowed to take office in 1856, or he wouldn't have taken office of a united country, just as he didn't in 1861. But it's a lovely question. It's always nice to take counterfactuals because you can never be proved wrong.
Yes, and it's very alluring to read history backward, which you could say that to some extent we all have to do.
Yeah.
But it's the causes and consequences are complex. That's for sure.
I will just mention here that as a longtime science fiction fan, alternate history What If the South Had Won, along with What If the Nazis Had Won, is one of the two most popular alternate histories. And I'll recommend everyone the classic by Ward Moore, Bring the Jubilee. Small digression. I have a question from John Hoskinson. Why wasn't the US government able to purchase the freedom of the slaves as was done in England? And I will substitute the possibility, why didn't the US government choose to? And I will also add the parallel of the Russian freedom of the serfs, taking place over a generation. To whomever. Does anybody want to answer that first?
I don't think that was even on the agenda of anybody in the government. The solution, which we haven't talked about, which was endorsed by Lincoln in public, however, he might have had private misgivings, was just letting Black people go back to Africa or other countries and relieving the tension that way. And I mean, all these issues came up during the war, especially Lincoln tried during the war to recompense Southern states who would, the states of the Confederacy, as well as the loyal border states. We will recompense you for your slaves if you will declare emancipation, and they didn't take him up on his offer. So I think it was true. Also, in regards to the counterfactual, Harry Turtledove is good on that too.
Another splendid author, yeah. if I may say so.
Yeah, my take on that is that, of course, there was the abolitionist movement was absolutely hostile to the idea of compensating slave owners. Not that they were influential, but it was a very clear moral position that you should in no way reward people for the benefits that they had secured by exploiting human beings. It was a lot easier. I mean, just looking at the English, but the British position, of course, it was a very different situation in respect of the power of the West Indian planters relative to the metropolis, as opposed to the power of the southern planters in relation to their metropolis. But on the question of political initiatives for compensation, Joan is quite right, of course she is, in pointing to Lincoln's offer, particularly to the border states, through the latter part of 1861 and the first half of 1862. He pointed out initially in his proposal for Delaware that, if you bought out all the slaves for Delaware, it was a fraction of the cost of the ongoing expenditure on the war. And he made the same case, of course, to Kentucky and to in particular Kentucky and to Maryland slave owners. His interest there was not just in making a start on emancipation, but demonstrating to the Confederacy that they would not be able to secure the support of the border states. I mean, this was a real concern in the first year of the war, that the slave-holding border might be in a position, might be moved to join the Confederacy, even though in fact there was a considerable federal army presence increasingly during 1862. So that was one of the reasons behind his proposal for emancipation, compensated emancipation. But to his disappointment, none of the representatives of the border, say the congressional representatives of the border states, were prepared to go along with that.
Thank you. I'll move to another question, if I may, by Wayne Strasbow. If the war was inevitable, have historians been too critical of the Pierce and Buchanan administrations in employing temporizing measures to postpone its outbreak? I'm going to direct that one first to Brian, I think, because I believe he was strong on the inevitable outbreak thesis.
I wouldn't so much suggest that Pierce and Buchanan were employing temporizing measures as exacerbating the conflict, right? Certainly, Buchanan's endorsement of the Lecompton Constitution comes immediately to mind as something that's rather inexplicable. Pierce declaring the Free Soil Territorial Legislature in Kansas to be insurrectionaries, ignoring a congressional investigation that had determined that Free Soilers were a true majority on the ground in Kansas. And instead, he sends federal troops into Topeka to put down Free Soilers and to embrace the pro-slavery territorial legislature. So Pierce and Buchanan are, as Richard mentioned, they're dough-faced Democrats who are beholden to the slave interest, and that further fractures the Northern Democratic Party and serves to lend some ballast to this slave power conspiracy theory. And I think, further poisons the already fragile political situation as it existed in the mid-1850s.
I would like to add, just because James Buchanan always comes down at the bottom of the list of presidents to be rated by modern scholars, as in the last C-SPAN one, that the comment by the member of the audience is really interesting, in that we look at them today in light of what we know is going to happen. And what I tried to describe is that all of these differences, yet we do know that they stayed together through compromise with 7 slaveholding presidents. So it wasn't actually the kind of outrage that we look back on it now, the political, the idea that you wanted to keep the Union together. And both Pierce and Buchanan were acting under extraordinary stress, it must be said. They didn't implement the right policies. Buchanan had all kinds of problems. He presided over an incredibly corrupt administration in many ways, but their idea was just to stop this, what they thought of madness, and keep the southern part of the Democratic Party that it had somehow stayed together, North and South and various constituencies together. And so I think that there are a lot of studies that have some kind of nuance in that way. But it is true that they were called dough faces, Southern and Northern politicians who faced South, who favored the South. But that's possibly describes most politicians in this period, at least in the Democratic Party of the North.
If we're casting aspersions or blame on Pierce and Buchanan, I have to say my particular contempt is for Pierce, because in endorsing the Kansas-Nebraska bill, he was endorsing, Joan rightly says, there had been a sequence of compromises. The problem with the Kansas-Nebraska bill, as Brian mentioned, was that it overturned what was seen as a long-standing compact, part of a compromise. And it was a betrayal. It was seen as a betrayal, and it allowed the independent Democrats, Salmon Chase and others, to present the administration of Pierce as somehow just morally bankrupt, and being insensitive to, putting it mildly, to the preciousness of previous compromises. It certainly exploded the Democratic Party. It gave the opportunity for the Republicans to, what became the Republican Party, to cohere around Free Soilers, dissident Democrats, anti-slavery Whigs. So when I say contempt for Pierce, I'm probably overstating it, but I do think that he had an opportunity that Buchanan, in a sense, Buchanan was trying to make up for the lost ground, really, and he was Buchanan's hand was Buchanan was dealt a more difficult hand than Pierce was dealt, and it was Pierce who dealt him that hand.
And it should be said as an index of that betrayal that was sensed at the time, that Pierce becomes in 1856 the only incumbent president denied renomination by his own party for a second term. I mean, even members of his own party were cognizant of the scale of this betrayal.
Excuse me for interrupting you, Brian, at the beginning. I blame Stephen Douglas.
Yes.
He was a major figure coming toward the Compromise of 1850, and it was his introduction as chairman of the Committee on Territories that in 1854 brought to the Kansas-Nebraska Act that exquisitely tried to balance the South and the North, and it's just it just created, as Stephen Douglas himself said, a firestorm of protest. And he really, I mean, he was the golden boy of the Democratic Party, and largely due to his own efforts, he destroyed that future for himself anyway.
Actually, if I may follow up on that, how many people at the time were saying to him, "You're making a great mistake"? I mean, again, there's the usual hindsight and stuff at the time, but you're saying he made a great mistake. I mean, could he have done differently? How clear was it that this was being a great mistake?
Well, I would say that lots of people in his own party, certainly his political opponents, thought this was a great mistake, and he should have gotten a clue when he put forward this bill to satisfy his own economic ambitions of a transcontinental railroad, which is what the Kansas-Nebraska bill was in part to facilitate, when he had to really give away a lot to the Southern senators who opposed it. And I think that there were plenty of signs for him, but then you never know, do you? I mean, he was a bold, ambitious, young Democrat replacing the elders who had died mostly by 1850 and 1852. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, I think one measure of contemporary measure of the mistake is to look at the midterm elections of 1854, where Northern Democrats lose something like 80 seats in Congress. To look at the response of Salmon Chase and others in the appeal of the independent Democrats, where again they're decrying Douglas and the Kansas-Nebraska bill as a gross violation of a sacred pledge. They realize that this is a departure from a compact that had preserved the Union.
And it led directly to the founding and flourishing of the Republican Party, directly. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about it. I agree with that.
So I'm going to mention Southern Unionists, Andrew Johnson and Sam Houston. How much does their existence complicate your description of the South, and how much does their existence give one a sense of contingency for other paths the South could have taken politically?
Well, I've talked too much. But Andrew Johnson is an interesting case here for me, because he is the only senator who remained loyal to the Union, and then he came back to Tennessee. And what we all, again, one of the lowest ranked presidents recently, but one of the things that's the items of information that are lost now about Andrew Johnson is that he came out in mid-war as Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee for emancipation. I mean, he was really quite considered a rogue of the Southern section when he did that, and so I think that there were a lot of Southern Unionists, but not, other than Andrew Johnson and I suppose Sam Houston, I can't think of any that had a lot of influence, at least initially.
I think, sorry, Brian, you go ahead.
No, I think it's important, especially in the case of Sam Houston, to contextualize that unionism, right? I mean, Sam Houston, 2 blocks from where I'm seated right now in Huntsville, Texas, in 1860, as Texas is hurtling toward secession. I mean, he's making the case, let's remain loyal to the Union, not because he believes remaining loyal to the Union is the best way to preserve slavery. It makes the argument that slavery has been perfectly secure within the Union for the last 8 decades. And he accurately predicts, right? He lays out the case that if we go off to war, it's going to lead to emancipation. It's going to lead to a servile insurrection, just the way, just exactly what we feared. And I think contextualizing that unionism and understanding that it's perfectly consistent in the 19th century world to be a unionist who also defends slavery, that's important for us.
Yeah, I would absolutely want to underline that and come back to Alexander Stephens. Stephens, after all, in the Georgia debates over secession, is very clear that a secession is a bad move strategically because it's going to bring about an upheaval, which slavery is unlikely to survive. In the event, of course, when Georgia decides to secede, he goes along with it and indeed becomes vice president of the Confederacy. But it's his view that the Union is a better security for the future of slavery. He was right, than secession. As for the extent to which there is unionism in the South, I think it has to be remembered that to be considered that there was an overestimation. Lincoln overestimated the power of Southern unionism in the early months of 1861. His reading of Southern unionism, I think, was no doubt in part relating to his knowledge of Alexander Stephens, his former Whig colleague in Congress in the late 1840s. Generally throughout the North in the early months of the war, there was a sense that it was the secession minority, the kind of elite, the conspiratorial elite who had misled the mass of Southerners, the non-slaveholding Southerners, and that as the war progressed, so their resistance to their opposition to the leadership would emerge. That was entirely shot as an argument in the early months of 1862, by which stage it was very clear that non-slaveholding Southerners were in for the whole game. And so I think it's too easy to overstate the degree of disloyalty towards the Confederacy once the move has been made. As you say, Brian, it's a particular kind of unionism. It's a protective unionism because that union, the Constitution as is, the Union as was, is what the Confederates and indeed what a conservative element in the North want from the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important to emphasize that there were divisions in both the Confederate and the United States, within the Confederates and the United States during the war. And you had a division that I don't know if you could call the West Virginians exactly unionists, but they voted to secede from the Confederacy. So there, how do you feel about that? But in almost every southern state, perhaps except South Carolina, there was a group of I mean, I'm not talking about African Americans who had a unique perspective on the desire for their freedom, but there were whites who didn't agree with the increasing sacrifice and destruction of the war, who might have been more and in fact expressed their discontent with the way things were going. And if I may, I mean, I will say that as much as the war became, especially for the present people of the present time, about emancipation and Black equality, that wasn't first and foremost in the mind of every Northerner either. And I think first and foremost was to preserve the Union. And I think you see that that kind of sentiment unfolding in Reconstruction and then into the early 20th century in the impulse toward reconciliation.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with that. And if one looks at the North during the Civil War, the Democratic Party remains extremely healthy, extremely buoyant, and comes really quite close to winning the 1864 election. This is contingency, but if Atlanta had not happened when it did, it was entirely conceivable that the Democrats would have won. That didn't mean to say that the Democrats would have necessarily wanted to give up the Union, but I think in practical terms, because in fact, the vast majority of the overwhelming majority of Democrats and Republicans during the war was strong for the Union and for reunification. It was just the question of the means by which you did it. And for the overwhelming majority of Democrats, the means of emancipation was getting in the way of reunion. So there are two cultural camps in the North. I'm oversimplifying things. But after the Emancipation Proclamation of New Year's Day, 1863, politics in the North becomes much more polarized. And on the conservative side, you have a small minority of Republicans, former Republicans, and a significant, overwhelming majority of Democrats who see the move towards emancipation as being destructive of the war effort and of breaking the unity of the war effort. And this is why of course, in the elections in fall of 1862, the Democrats do so well following the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Not the only reason, but that is one of the reasons why they do so well. So I think it's very important to remember that the Union was politically very significantly divided, and that those two parties do represent very different visions of what the Union should be. And as you say, Joan, that plays out in Reconstruction and indeed beyond.
I have a question which is going to be drawing on one by Jim Soderberg, who mentions the different images of a covenant being used, the northern version of an indissoluble covenant, and the southern one, Robert Dabney being quoted here, a voluntarily formed covenant. And I guess my first question is there any difference in the religious background of North and South, which would lead you toward a indissoluble covenant understanding versus a voluntary one? Or is it just the political point of view informing that? And I guess I would actually, but then to push this on forward, the bit about a crusade, how strongly is the religious background of America forming, how should I put this, both the will to fight, to dissolve, and the way the Civil War is fought? That's a broad question, I know, but I just want to sort of throw it at you all.
Well, I'll just come in quickly and then leave it to the others. But I think you put your finger on it when you talk about differing approaches to the idea of covenant. I think this is politically driven. It's a justification, taking a certain political view and then giving that the covenantal significance. But the covenant in and of itself is very important. I think the idea of a covenant. And I do see not only between North and South a cultural or kind of a war of religious nationalisms, but I also see within the North two contending religious nationalisms. One is an anti-slavery nationalism driven by the vast majority by 1864 of Protestants who are almost lock, stock and barrel behind the Lincoln administration and in support, even conservative Presbyterians supporting emancipation. And on the other side in the North, your Catholics, overwhelmingly Irish, of course, but Catholic Church and some deep-dyed conservative Protestants on the Democrat side, a conservative religious nationalism. And in the South, a religious nationalism which is sustaining the ardor of and the commitment of Southerners to the cause, a belief that right is on their side, that at one point I think Brian talked about Northern meddlers. This was how the South saw the North, as it having apostatized, having broken with true religion, with religious orthodoxy. The North was full of isms of Mormonism and Millerism and feminism and these kind of breaches with conservative doctrine, breaches with a Bible that actually sustained slavery by its certainly with regard to the patriarchs, with regard to Old Testament practice, and in respect of the New Testament, the fact that Christ and his disciples lived in the age of Roman slavery and never said a word about it. To the extent that they did, it was about St. Paul urging the return of fugitive slaves. So they feel that they have got the gospel and the Old Testament on their side. So why then are they losing the battles? And the part of the answer they discover is, or I think they find, is in the fact that they have been in breach of their responsibilities as Christians in breaking marriages, breaking families, in not allowing slaves to read and be the first-hand readers of the scriptures. So there is a breach in the way in which slaves are treated. There is a breach with righteousness in that respect, but that slavery itself is a not only acceptable, but indeed scriptural institution. I don't know whether that answers your question, goes far enough to answer your question, but yeah.
It's interesting also because I know there are the pre-war tradition of slave owner reformers who are arguing we must be moral slave owners. And what you're saying is that in effect provides the precedent for the later explanation for why are we losing the war, if I may read it that way.
I mean, I would point out that both Lincoln and Jefferson Davis call days of Thanksgiving and prayer and of fasting. Interestingly enough, in the South, because this is pre-war seen as a pretty Puritan and New England practice, but it's a way of reaching out to constituencies of the faithful who are perceived on both sides being enormously significant in shaping popular attitudes. Indeed, if you look at Southern secession, it's very interesting to see how the charge is being led not just by politicians, but by clergy in the South.
I think that I agree with what Richard says, and I do want to make a comment about there had never been a war like this that had mobilized so many young men on both sides, as we know, roughly 3.5 on the Union, 1.5 million, 3.5 million on the Union, 1.5 on the Confederacy, and it first felt like these young men were let out of prison. I mean, there's many accounts, and I mean of shenanigans going on, all kinds of moral moral failings on the part of these young men that concerned many parents at home. But I think what you see, and historians of religion have done a marvelous job, including Richard, of really understanding the depth of Christianity and Christian actions and the exceptionalism of the American nation was tied to Christianity, I think. And when the country split in both ways and maybe different ways. But the ubiquitousness and the fear of death played a great role in bringing religion, bringing thousands of chaplains to both armies, holding services every week, and prayer meetings. And there were huge revivals in both armies, particularly in the Southern Army, when the Southern Army in many areas was losing or felt that they were losing, and it seemed to generate some kind of renewed enthusiasm. But it was such an important part of people's lives back then in a way that I don't think we can understand today. And I think that religion was political, maybe not in the same way that the Catholic Church was in the age of Henry VIII, but it was inherently political in the United States.
Thank you. Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think my colleagues handled it well.
In that case, we're approaching the end of our session. I would love it if I could ask each of you to have some sort of concluding remarks, a minute or so a piece, and then I could do a sort of a close up for the entire session as a whole. Shall we do it in the same order in which people spoke, just for predictability?
Sure. I really don't know. I don't have much to add except that to maybe flesh out something I've already alluded to, is that the Civil War has so many complex and interrelated issues that I have found it very difficult as an historian throughout my career, beginning when I was undergraduate and graduate student, to read the magnificent and conflicting generations of historians who have come to the exact opposite conclusions on what were the causes of the Civil War, why the North won the Civil War, and was Reconstruction a success or failure. So I think the causes and the conflict and the aftermath of the American Civil War has elicited more intense debate and passionate feelings from generations of scholars and just regular American citizens, that it continues to draw us into this great national drama. And that's all I have to say. And I'm happy to be a part of it.
I would echo what Joan has to say about, this is a really, really exciting time to be a Civil War historian. We're really beneficiaries of scholarship that's reached beneath some of the old generalizations about this conflict to really get at lived human experience. The event is it's no longer this discrete event, but it's really now a complex lived experience through scholarship that's looked through the history of emotions, at environmental history, at just an increasing material culture, just an increasingly wide array of methodological tools that we've peered through as scholars, and have revealed just how complex the event truly was. So it's been a real pleasure to be a part of this conversation this afternoon.
Well, I certainly would like to endorse that and reflect that when I set out as an American historian back in the 1970s, the Civil War was barely on the agenda. And if you look at some of the great books of the 1970s, there are very, very few on the relating to the Civil War. The field now has been transformed. If I pick up one thing from the chat, it was a question from Michael Kellman. Were the world historical stakes as momentous as claimed by Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address? And I think one thing that I'd like to come back to, which I was hinting at in my opening remarks, it was when Lincoln said that the Union was the last best hope of Earth, when he said in his letter to Greeley that all men everywhere should be free, and when he said in the Gettysburg Address that it was not this government, but it was government, not American government, but government, that putting an end to free government upon earth, as he said elsewhere, is what the war threatened. We should remember the international dimensions of the Civil War, both in the respect of the recruitment for the armies. I mean, a third of Union recruits were probably certainly a quarter were foreign born. Most of them were American citizens, but a number came from abroad. They served in ethnic regiments, French, German, Hungarian, Irish, Italian, Polish, Scandinavian. Lincoln entirely understood their enthusiasm and readiness to suffer for what he and they perceived as a cause of global significance. We shouldn't forget that Karl Marx was a huge admirer of Lincoln and what Lincoln stood for. I mentioned Lincoln's remarks on the labor theory of value. I don't know that he necessarily got those from Marx, and Lincoln certainly believed in capital. But Marx, on behalf of the international working men, wrote to Lincoln, and Lincoln wrote back. This is an international community of radicals. I mean, look at the way in which the radicals of 1848 write to Lincoln during the war and are on the side of the Union. So they see this struggle as a struggle for humankind. If the American experiment in representative government and democracy falls, this is the last best hope of the world that has gone. And the, post 1848, with the huge conservative reaction after that in Europe, there is a sense that the world is on a knife edge, on a watershed, and America is the influence and can push it in the right direction if the Civil War ends as they want it to. And at times it's looking as though it's not going to. So that's my more than 1 minute. Sorry, but that's what I have to say. Thank you.
And thank you. Oh, sorry. And thank you so much. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure to listen to you. I'm sorry if I cut you off right there at the end. So just to say, it's been wonderful hearing you. To everybody whose questions you did not get answered, as I say, please send them to me. I will forward them on so that the panelists can choose to respond to you. And I would also like to mention, once again, this will be recorded, put up onto the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. A link will be sent to everybody, both the participants and the audience, so that you will be able to see this, you'll be able to pass it on to your friends. And in addition, I am going to plug, of course, we are continuing with our series. Our Great American Novel Series is continuing on next week, October 5th, with a discussion of Moby Dick. And we will be returning to our history series with a discussion of Reconstruction on October 26th. If I'm missing one coming up in October, please forgive me. But stay tuned. We are continuing, and this is a very high bar to meet the quality of this one, but I certainly hope that all our continuing ones will be at least as good as this. So again, thank you all so much. It's been wonderful.
Yes, thank you.